Welcome to the Tech Talk by Microsoft EMEA. My name is Manfred Helber. I'm a Microsoft Most Valuable Professional in the category Cloud and Data Center. And today we have a Tech Talk with 1 hour for your questions about Microsoft technologies. So the Tech Talk Q&A is your time for your questions. You can enter your questions into the chat. So depending on which platform you're watching, YouTube or LinkedIn, you can use the chat or the comments functionality to send in your questions. It will take about 30 seconds till I see the questions here in my control panel, and so I can answer them directly. You can ask about Microsoft technologies, you can ask about Microsoft licensing, you can give feedback, whatever you want. So feel free to send in your questions, your comments, your topics about Microsoft technologies. I will use a few minutes to tell you what the next Tech Talks will be. And I have some content I will present to you till you send in your questions. So the next Tech Talk is on Monday. Next Monday, we have Windows Admin Center update there. It's a very interesting topic because we will talk about the new stuff in Windows Admin Center preview of the next version. Then on November 28th, we will talk about Azure Kubernetes Services on Azure Stack HCI, what it is, how it works, what you can use it for. And on November the 29th, we have an Tech Talk Q&A like today for your questions. And in December, on the 5th of December, we will talk about Azure Stack HCI resiliency, so cache drives, cluster, stretch cluster, Azure backup, Azure site recovery. So you're welcome to join these sessions in December also. On December the 12th, we have Azure Stack HCI networking, things like connectivity, teaming, and so on. December the 13th, we have a Tech Talk Q&A. And in December the 19th, we have Azure Stack HCI security, so secured core and topics like this. Till you send in your questions today, I will talk a little bit about specific licensing scenarios in Windows Server because I receive questions about this on a regular basis. So it's still your hour for your questions, but actually there are no questions in the chat, and so I will use the time to take some typical questions from the community. And so I will take first a few minutes to talk about the editions. Windows Server 2022 is available in 3 editions. It's Essentials, it's Standard, it's Data Center. Essentials has its very own licensing terms. Standard and Data Center is licensed based on the physical cores of the physical hardware, and to access services or to use services provided by Windows Server, we need Windows Server client access licenses, and the client access licenses are version specific. So this means if you are running Windows Server 2022, you will need Windows Server 2022 access licenses, client access licenses. It's not okay to use previous license versions, but for sure you can use a later Windows Server client access licensing version to access previous Windows Server editions. So you can use the newer CAL version to access older Windows Server editions. But if, for example, you have an environment where you have already Windows Server 2019 client access licenses, you are not allowed to use these CALs to access Windows Server 2022. Regarding the licensing of the Windows Server, it's core-based, so we have to license all the physical cores in a physical hardware, minimum 16. If we license all the cores in a physical hardware, we receive 2 virtual usage rights when we license with Windows Server 2022 Standard. When we license all the cores in the server 2 times, we receive 4 virtual usage rights. And when we license all the cores in the server 3 times, we receive 6 virtual Windows Server usage rights and so on. The minimum is always 16 cores. So when our server has only 8 cores, we have to license 16 with standard to receive 2 virtual usage rights, 32 with standard to receive 4 virtual usage rights, and 48 cores with standard to receive 6 virtual usage rights. It's always all the cores in the server, minimum 16. It's very easy, but if you have questions, feel free to bring it up in the chat. This means when we have an Hyper-V host and we install Hyper-V, we activate the Hyper-V role, then we'll receive the hypervisor, and we can start to create virtual machines. Virtual machine 1, virtual machine 2. What we here see is exactly what's included in the licensing of Windows Server 2022 Standard on this physical host. Yes, we see 3 Windows Server installations, but the first one, Windows Server 2022, is the parent partition. And the parent partition is required in combination with Hyper-V. So these 2 elements here, parent partition and Hyper-V, build one entity. They need each other, and we are not allowed to use this parent partition for other services. So the parent partition is not our domain controller. It's not our file server. It's our component required for the Hyper-V host for managing resources, providing resources to the VMs, and so on. So yes, we see 3 Windows Server installations here. We can also connect to 3 different machines, but only 2 of them, so this machine number 1 and number 2, they are usable for our workloads. This first one here, the parent partition, the number 0, is only for providing the Hyper-V technologies. When we stack, we receive additional virtual usage rights. Important to clarify this again. When we license all the cores in the server again, minimum 16, we have 2 additional virtual usage rights. And when we license them again, we have 6 virtual usage rights. When we license the host with data center, we have unlimited virtual Windows Server usage rights. So it's also possible to use data center. The break even is usually when you have 10 virtual machines with Windows Server operating system on a physical host. It's similar if you are using a third-party hypervisor. But if you use a third-party hypervisor, you decide not to use the Windows Server parent, but you're using the third-party hypervisor. You are investing additional money in the third-party licensing, and you don't use the powerful Hyper-V. I had a customer scenario yesterday where the customer didn't use Hyper-V, and we had the situation that they reached the limits of their hypervisor, a well-known hypervisor. They reached their limits regarding the disks they could attach to a virtual machine. I said, this is no problem with Hyper-V because we can add up to 4 SCSI controllers, and on each SCSI controller up to 256 drives. We can have up to 2 terabytes of memory. We can have something like 1024 virtual CPUs in a virtual machine. So we can have really, really powerful virtual machines in Hyper-V. So if you are still on the situation that you think, okay, Hyper-V is included, but if I need more, I should invest in a third-party solution, then you should review the scalability and the technical capabilities of Hyper-V, because in my opinion, You know, I'm not a Microsoft employee, Microsoft most valuable professional. This means I'm working very close with the technologies. I'm analyzing what's possible with the technologies. I'm writing about it. I'm creating videos like this. And Hyper-V is really, in my opinion, one of the most powerful hypervisors in the market. And it's included in Windows Server. We don't have any additional costs when we use Hyper-V. This is important to understand. So using Hyper-V does not result in any additional costs if we have Windows Server licensed. On the other hand, when we invest in a third-party hypervisor, we cannot reduce our Windows Server licensing costs. If you have any scenario where you think, oh, let's use hypervisor A or B, so I can reduce my Windows Server licensing costs. This is not possible if you have the same Windows Server workload you have in Hyper-V. Every scenario where you think you could reduce your Windows Server licensing costs in using a third-party hypervisor will result in mislicensing. What to say about a high available configuration? The important thing is, in all these scenarios, virtualization, Hyper-V replica, clustering, you can use the OEM license. This is important because the OEM license of Windows Server is a very affordable type of Windows Server license that provides all the technical stuff you have in the other licensed licensing channels of Windows Server. So regarding the technology, you don't have any advantage in using another license option than OEM licenses. The difference is in the way how the machines are activated. An OEM license has an activation per machine with a unique key per machine. The volume license knows something like a multi-activation key or a key management service. This means you have one key for several servers. For sure, you have to license them. You have higher costs than with the OEM license. But with the OEM license, for each server you have licensed accordingly, you will receive an individual key. In the volume licensing field, you have the multi-usage option for keys. The number of cores that have to be licensed are the same for OEM and for volume licenses. The costs are per core about 40% less when you decide for the OEM licensing. Let's have a look at this Hyper-V replica scenario here. When we are using Hyper-V replica with Windows Server, we have the situation that we build redundancy on the VM level. So the virtual machine is replicated from one host to the other host. The blue one is online, the green one is offline. Maybe I should use red for offline, but important is here we don't have an issue. This is a planned down or offline situation of the machine because the green ones are the replica VMs for the blue ones. This means if a host fails here, we can switch over to the other host and continue our workload there. This is a manual action, but when we look at this scenario, when we go back to the initial situation, we have 4 virtual machines on each server, but only 2 of them are running. This means I need to license each of these hosts once with Windows Server 2022 standard. All the cores, minimum 16, so each server has to be licensed with standard with minimum 16 cores, but all the cores in the hosts have to be licensed. Because the licensing terms state that we have to license running virtual machines, not the virtual machines that are prepared or created or stored there. But now let's think about the failover scenario. Now we have 4 virtual machines running on the host on the left-hand side. Important, Hyper-V replica, this is a manual action. This doesn't occur automatically. This means if you have each host only licensed for the workload of 2 virtual machines, you can use Hyper-V Replica, but you are not licensed for the failover. Maybe you have only Hyper-V Replica, or you use Hyper-V Replica only for backup. So maybe you wait till your initial host comes back and then you replicate the workload back to the initial host and then you continue to work. Then this would be fine. But if you switch over your workload to the other host, then for sure in exactly this picture here, we have to ensure that the host on the left-hand side is licensed accordingly to run 4 virtual machines. This means I have to license all the cores in the host twice for Windows Server 2022 standard, minimum 32 cores. And I should do the same on the right-hand side to be flexible, to be able to have a failover to the left-hand side and to the right-hand side. This is my recommendation. In a cluster, we have the situation that we don't trigger this failover manually. In a cluster, if a host fails, the failover occurs automatically. If the load increases on a host, the virtual machines are moved by live migration automatically to the other host. This means we have to be prepared for all the situations. So when we look at the initial situation this year, it would be fine to have both hosts licensed 2 times with all the cores for Windows Server 2022 standard. Yes, standard includes clustering. Standard does not include storage spaces direct, but here we are working with external storage with iSCSI or Fiber Channel. This is possible with standard here. If now if the host fails and the virtual machines fail over to the other host, we have 6 virtual machines. And for this scenario, we need the physical cores in the host licensed 3 times with standard. This means to be prepared for every scenario in this cluster, we should, or we have to license all the cores in the physical host 3 times with Windows Server 2022 standard, or once with data center. So then we are also ready for future growth here. So I will continue with my topics in a few minutes, but let's go back to this slide. The TechTalk Q&A is for your questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to bring the questions here up in the chat. I'm happy to answer them. If there are no questions, I will use the time to spend some additional time on this typical ask licensing topics, because in my opinion, they are very important for you. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the Azure Stack HCI. Azure Stack HCI is an operating system that runs on premises. Azure Stack HCI is installed on physical hardware. Azure Stack HCI is a service from Azure, and Azure Stack HCI is charged on a physical core per month basis. It's calculated per day, but typically the price in the price list is per month. $10 per physical core per month for the Azure Stack HCI OS usage. We don't have included any virtual usage rights for Windows Server in there. This means if you're running Linux VMs, you don't need anything else from Microsoft. But if you are running Windows Server VMs, you will need to license your physical hosts with Windows Server 2022 standard, or you need to license your physical hosts with Windows Server 2022 data center. This results in virtual usage rights. When you use standard, this results in 2 virtual usage rights for each licensing round, for each licensing of all the physical cores, minimum 16 in your hosts. When you use data center, this results in unlimited virtual usage rights. For sure, you have to license all the hosts, not the cluster, but all the hosts. Now we have something new here. If you have licensed Windows Server 2020 to data center in combination with software assurance, you have something that's called hybrid use benefit. And the Windows Server 2022 OEM license plus software assurance ensures that we have the usage rights for Azure Stack HCI with zero additional costs. So we don't have to pay the $10 per physical core per month. And we have also included the Windows Server subscription. This is an alternate way to activate virtual machines and to license virtual machine workload with Windows Server operating system on an Azure Stack HCI cluster. And so we have included the subscription, we have included the Azure Stack HCI usage, and so Windows Server 2022 data center with software assurance is a great deal. This is also a great deal when you think about the end of support for Windows Server 2012 and 2012 R2. The end of support for these two versions will occur in October 2023. This support end means that I don't receive any updates any longer, no security updates, no hot fixes, nothing, except I subscribe for the extended security updates. With extended security updates, I can extend my security updates after the extended support end date, but usually I have to pay for it. This means customers, for example, with an enterprise agreement, could subscribe for the extended security updates for up to 3 years. They have to invest a relatively huge amount of money to receive these extended security updates. If they would migrate their workload to Azure, they would receive the extended security updates for free. And the interesting thing is, if they migrate the workload to Azure Stack HCI, they also receive the extended security updates for free. This means if you have Windows Server 2022 data center licensed with software assurance, or if you decide to have Windows Server 2022 data center in combination with the Azure Stack HCI subscription with $10 per core per month, then we have included the extended security updates for the VM workloads there. It's for free, it's no additional charge there, it's included in this licensing combination. And this is a great opportunity if you have customers that will not be able to migrate their Server 2012 or 2012 R2 workload till October next year. So I will continue on this in a few minutes. We have a question in the chat. The question is, how do you connect to your Azure environment? Do you use direct access or a VPN? What are your recommendations? For Azure Stack HCI, we need a connectivity to Azure to upload the information for billing. This means when we have the Azure cloud here on the top, let's use some blue color here. We have here Azure. Then we have a connectivity from the servers to Azure through the internet. They use port 443. It's a traditional internet access. We don't need any direct access or VPN or things like this. We only need internet connectivity. Proxy configurations are also supported. If we are thinking about using services in Azure, like for example, let's think we have some storage in Azure, or let's think we have in Azure some things like backup. or we have things like monitor. Then we could run all these things also through the public internet connectivity with a secured connection. It's an SSL connectivity. But for sure, it could come to a point where we think about using direct connectivity. This can be virtual private network. This can also be technologies like express route, and this depends on our needs. Yeah, it's for many services, it's possible to use the internet connectivity only. VPN is the next step that is relatively cheap, and the addition is here, or maybe I'm using file shares in Azure. Yeah, VPN is relatively cheap. And the express route would be the, it's a high class service with most costs, but with a dedicated connectivity you use for your Azure connection. This means it depends on the services, the type of services, the amount of volume you will use. Because as soon as you are using VPN or express route or services like this, you have additional costs for the data transfer, and you can have a flat configuration where all the data traffic is included, or you have to pay per gigabyte or per terabyte. So it really depends. Okay, thanks for this question about the connectivity. Many options are available, and it depends on your needs, what you're using. Yeah, hello. So feel free, if you have questions, to send them in, to use the chat. I will use some more time to talk a little bit about the licensing stuff. We had this topic about the hybrid use and the extended security updates when you move your workload to Azure Stack HCI. And I mentioned the situation that we have a hybrid use benefit when we have a licensing on the Azure Stack HCI in combination with software assurance. So let's talk about another hybrid benefit we have. There's also a hybrid benefit when we bring our workload to Azure. So if you have your servers licensed with OEM license plus software assurance, then you have the situation that you can use virtual machines in Azure with saving up to 40%, because the 40% are for the OS usage. When you create a virtual machine in Azure, you have costs for the CPU usage, for the memory usage, for the storage usage, and you have costs for the OS, except you have the OS already. And so it's not enough to have a volume license or to have an OEM license. You have to have this license, for example, OEM license plus software assurance. Then you are qualified for using the Azure Hybrid benefit. And this means that you can use up to 2 instances in Azure with 8 cores in each instance, or 1 instance with 16 cores for each set of 16 core licenses, data center or standard on premises. This means you have 16 cores licensed on premises, then you are qualified to run 2 virtual machines in Azure with 8 cores each, where you save the licensing costs, or 1 virtual machine with 16 cores. It is not possible to, from the technical perspective, yes, but not from the licensing, to create 4 virtual machines with 4 cores. So the minimum is 8 cores you have to use for these machines regarding the licensing hybrid use benefit. And the great thing about this is if you have data center edition licensed on premises in combination with software assurance, it's always with software assurance, Then we have the simultaneous usage on premises in Azure. This means for every 16 cores data center you have on premises with software assurance, you receive 2 virtual machines in Azure with up to 8 cores each, where you save 40% of the costs. When you have standard licensed on premises, in combination with software assurance, we have the usage either on premises or in Azure. We have 180 days where we have the dual usage right for the migration of the workload. Okay, then we have a question. Hi, can some services work locally except for guest VMs when Azure Stack HCI is connected to the cloud only to pay for the OS, and all the other services can be used locally? So what you are meaning is here, let's check if I have a picture for this. Azure Stack HCI needs a connectivity to Azure every 30 days minimum to upload the information about the core count we have in the servers, and this is used for billing. And yes, you could configure your firewall, for example, so that exactly only this information about the number of cores can be uploaded to Azure for charging you for these services. And now the question is, can I run any workloads locally except for guest VMs when I only have this connectivity for billing? So I assume you are thinking about workloads like, for example, Windows Server 2022 Data Center Azure Edition. This is an exclusive extended edition of Windows Server for VMs that are running in Azure or on Azure Stack HCI. Yes, you can use this Data Center Azure Edition in VMs because when we connect to Azure for uploading the billing information of our cores, this is done automatically. We receive also the update for the Azure benefits we can use locally for the next 30 days. It's always for 30 days. We will receive extended security updates. Yes, we will eligible for extended security updates, but you have to allow additionally the Windows update targets. If your VMs don't have access to Windows Update, they will not receive updates. But this is the same for Windows machines that don't need these extended security updates. So your traditional Windows servers inside these VMs, for example, Windows Server 2019, 2022, will not update if you have no internet connectivity at all. But if you have only a partial internet connectivity, or if you say, okay, it's fine to have the ports for the billing information and Windows Update, then yes, you would also receive the extended security updates. Will I be able to run Azure Virtual Desktop on premises? No, not really, because Azure Virtual Desktop on premises requires, let's see if I have a picture about this here in some of my slides. No, it's not here, but I can find this for you. Let's look for architecture slide about Azure Virtual Desktop. It's not available publicly, so I have to switch to another presentation. Maybe this one is suitable. Let's see. Yeah. This is an Azure Virtual Desktop graphics from Microsoft in the Microsoft Learn here. And here we can see that in Azure Virtual Desktop, we have the situation that that my host pool here can be virtual machines in Azure or on premises. So this could be virtual machines on site. But when we connect from a session from a user here, when we connect from a user to a session host, we always have the Azure Active Directory involved, and we have the infrastructure in Azure like the connection host, like the web access and so on involved. This means Azure Virtual Desktop, if you are completely disconnected for 29 days, you cannot use you will not be able to connect to your Azure Virtual Desktops in this time. Can I use Azure Kubernetes services? You will need a connectivity from time to time because Azure Kubernetes services is charged also via Azure. But if you have OEM license plus software assurance, the Azure Virtual Desktop usage, the AKS, Azure Kubernetes Services usage is included. And so you will need the connectivity to activate or reactivate the usage rights, but it's okay to have this connectivity only every 30 days. This means, to sum it up, from regarding the workloads, you can use the Azure benefits inside the VMs, even if you are disconnected. You can use the Azure Kubernetes services. Your Azure Virtual Desktop workload will remain running, but you will have no user authentication and connectivity because this is handled by Azure. You will have the extensions for Azure Stack HCI from on-premises. So you will have extensions like the extended GPU support, the support for stretch clustering, and so on. But you have to connect minimum once every 30 days to ensure that your Azure Stack HCI keeps active. Active is the wrong word. That you need to be connected to Azure every 30 days, minimum once, to ensure that it can upload the billing information. If you are disconnected more than 30 days, you will not be able to put any new workload on Azure Stack HCI. So your nodes keep up and running, your virtual machines keep up and running, but you cannot create any new virtual machines. And usually in an Azure Stack HCI scenario, you will have connectivity because for extended security updates, you need the Windows Update service. For Azure Virtual Desktop, you need the authentication via the Azure cloud and so on. So hopefully this answered your question. When Azure Stack HCI is connected only for Pay the OS and all the other services can be used locally. Yeah, when we are using Azure Virtual Desktop on Azure Stack HCI, our virtual desktop targets are running locally in our cluster. So this means we don't have any data transfer to Azure, no user data, no session data. This is all locally, if this is the question. Maybe you can add some feedback if this answered your question, if you have any additional questions about this. So I can see if I can pick up or should pick up some additional other topics, or if we should go more deep into this Azure Stack HCI question. Yeah, so it's your time. Feel free to ask questions like this. So thank you very much for this question. It was a very, very good question, because this is the reason for Azure Stack HCI. Why do we use Azure Stack HCI? It's because we want to bring Azure workloads to on-premises. And so it's an important question to know which connectivity is still required, even if the workload is on premises. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about Windows Server 2022 and remote desktop services. This is also an interesting licensing scenario, or interesting scenario regarding the licensing. Remote desktop services need, additionally to our Windows Server client access licenses, remote desktop services client access licenses. And the RDS client access licenses, they are available in a per device basis, and they are available per user. Depending on your scenario, you will have advantages in using the per device model, or you will have advantages in using the per user model. Both is possible. Remote desktop services client access licenses can also be used in a later version to access earlier hosts. So if we have the RDS 2022 client access license version, we can access 2008 R2 session hosts. We can access 2012 session hosts. We can access 2012 R2 session hosts. We can access 2016 session hosts, 2019, and 2022 session hosts. If we have RDS 2019 client access licenses, we can access 2008, 2008 R2, 2012, 2012 R2, 2016, 2019, but not 2022. With 2016, for sure, not 2022 and not 2019. It's the same thing we have for the Windows Server client access licenses. But the difference is the Windows Server client access license has to be available. You have to buy these client access licenses, but there's no service in the Windows Server operating system where you have to enter these client access licenses. So there's no licensing server for Windows Server client access licenses. In Windows NT and Windows 2000 times, we had an tool in the surface of the Windows OS where we could enter an amount of client access license we had acquired. But this was only a value we entered. This value doesn't exist anymore. So Windows Server client access licenses have to be bought in the number of users or devices we have. We have no service where we have to activate the calls. We have no service where we have to enter the calls. It's different for remote desktop services. The RDS call is an additional call to the Windows Server license, client access license. So when we have remote desktop services client access licenses for Windows Server targets, we will also need Windows Server client access licenses. It's an additional client access license. This does not include the base license. Now, the important thing is the RDS client access license has to be activated on the RDS licensing server. This is a role component we install on Windows Server. And now we have the interesting thing, the RDS 2022 client access license. is only compatible with the 2022 RDS licensing server. It's not compatible with previous licensing server versions. This table here is often misinterpreted. Often we have the situation that customers think that these two information does not match. They say, how can this be that I'm allowed to use the client access license with Windows Server 2022 and previous versions when it's not possible from the technical perspective? Important, it is possible from the technical perspective, but you have to downgrade the license. Why? The Windows Server client access license, there's no active downgrade for this license because it's only a piece of licensing paper. When I now want to use the RDS 2022 client access license on an RDS 2019 licensing server, then I have to downgrade the RDS license 2022 to Windows Server 2019, because when I downgrade this license to 2019, then this license can be used on a 2019 licensing server. This means, how do we downgrade the license? We use the clearinghouse service. When you install an RDS licensing server, and when you enter the client access licenses on this licensing server, you have a small wizard, and this wizard guides you through the activation process. So if you have RDS 2022 client access licenses, you have a product key like you know it from your Windows Server. It's an additional key. You enter it at an 2022 licensing server, and you go to next, next, activate, next, finish. Then you can use this number of users that are licensed with exactly this key. If you have licensed 2022 RDS client access licenses and you want to use a 2019 licensing server, then you start this activation wizard. You enter the 2022 RDS client access license key, and you will receive an error message. It says, this is not a valid key. And then you have a link where you can click on Contact Clearinghouse Service. This is a phone number. This phone number is also available typically in your region. There's an international English language hotline, but in the most regions in the world, we have a region-specific hotline for this. It's only available in the typical business hours, so it depends on your region when you are able to call. So in Germany, it's typically between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. And on this phone hotline, you can provide your 2022 RDS client access license key. You will receive a 2019 client access license key for remote desktop services. And now you are able to add this key to the 2019 licensing server. An alternate option would be to upgrade the licensing server to 2022, but this is more work. And maybe you didn't buy the 2022 server license. Maybe you only invested in the 2022 RDS client access license to be prepared for the future. We had a question in the chat and the feedback that the question was already answered. So that I think this was about the situation that, you know, from the Windows Server client access licenses that we don't have to enter the licenses anywhere, but the RDS CALs, the remote desktop services client access licenses, have to be entered on the licensing server. And this is within 100. And this has to be done within 120 days after installing remote desktop services. This is the architecture of remote desktop services in Windows Server. And this licensing server is exactly the instance that provides the licensing for the whole infrastructure. We can start with the remote desktop services without having an RDS licensing server, but we need the licenses from the first connection on. So this does not mean we can use remote desktop services 120 days for free. This only means that we have time to solve our maybe existing technical issues regarding the licensing within 120 days. For sure, you have to be licensed accordingly all the time. In some previous TechTalk calls, we already talked about the office situation on RDS hosts. We have the situation, it's not the date from today I have entered here. So we have an Tech community article that says Microsoft will add the support for Microsoft 365 apps. Let's see the latest version of this article. It's opened here. So here we have an information about the situation, Office support on Windows Server 2022. There's a documentation and a support page and the supported versions we can open from here. And we have the situation about Windows Server 2022. Sorry, it is in German language. I will switch to English. There we can read that the support for Microsoft 365 apps in Windows Server 2022 is currently in preview. This means that, my slide from one of the previous Tech Talks says today 24th, but we can change this to the date of today. Today, the 15th of November, we have the situation that still we don't have the support for Microsoft 365 apps on Windows Server 2022, but for sure for Office LTSC and for Office 2019. But the announcement is from Microsoft is that later this year or maybe next year, we will have a support for Microsoft 365 apps till October 2026 on Windows Server 2020. Important, this support is not available today. It works, but if you ask me, Manfred, can you guarantee that it works? Can you help me if it does not work? Sorry, no, it's officially not supported today. We have a question. Hi, Manfred, can you please downgrade and upgrade back again your RDS CALs when needed? Yes, this is possible. This downgrade I mentioned via the clearinghouse service is done based on your, for example, Windows Server 2022 licenses. So you decided to downgrade your licenses via the clearinghouse service. The clearinghouse service is the phone number provided on the licensing server. And when you want to go back, you call again the clearinghouse service, and the clearinghouse service supports you to unregister the RDS 2019 license key you received from the clearinghouse service. And then you don't have to upgrade back because you still have your 2022 key. So the important step is where you need the clearinghouse service for bringing the RDS CALs back, you have to unregister your 2019 RDS client access license because you cannot use both in parallel. So absolutely, you stay on the usage rights you acquired with your license version. So if you bought RDS 2022 RDS CALs, you are eligible for using 2022 RDS session hosts. If you want to temporarily use a previous version, you can downgrade, and then you come back to the initially acquired version. Good question. Thanks for this one. So today I spent some time in explaining some often asked licensing scenarios. But for sure, the TechTalk Q&A is for your question. I only fill up the time where we don't have specific question, and maybe these topics I bring with me help you to think about questions. We had several questions about Azure Stack HCI, about RDS calls, about connectivity. I think these questions showed up because I was talking about these topics, and so hopefully this was helpful for you. So I'm saying thank you very much for your time. Feel free to send in some last questions for the last 5 minutes. And I want to come back to the information I already provided you when we started with this session. Next week, Monday, November 21st, we have a Tech Talk from 11:30 till 12:30. Yeah, for Windows Admin Center update, it's live streamed on YouTube or LinkedIn, depending where you're watching. And for sure, you can also ask your questions in these Tech Talks. But today was about all the questions you have from the Microsoft universe. On next Monday, it's about the Windows Admin Center, and your questions should be from the Windows Admin Center ecosystem. And for sure, the main thing in this Tech Talk on Monday is that I will show you what's possible with Windows Admin Center. The next talk, Tech Talk Q&A, is on 29th of November. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for your questions. Thanks for your interest, and looking forward to see you next Monday when we talk about the Windows Admin Center update and what's new in the latest version of Windows Admin Center. Bye.